Well, prices were still down this week, but flash sales were way up. In fact, I found myself wondering if we set a record for the number of flash sales in one full week of trading days. Pro Farmer Crop Tour was also on people's minds. Covered a lot of ground, counted a lot of kernels and bean pods across the grain belt this week, but the market didn't really care. Kohli and Cavanaugh stand by with their take on things coming up here in just a minute. The guys are brought to you by the Allen County Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau looking out for the interests of Hoosier farm families, and that would be like every day. Conversations recently about the tax situation on farm ground, and your Farm Bureau right in the middle of all of that. You know, from local and state issues all the way to Capitol Hill, your membership supports the efforts of the Farm Bureau. Go online to itpaystobeamember.org. Well, guys, the Pro Farmer Crop Tour got into Indiana for part of day one and part of day two, so it was kind of broken in half, two different pieces. David, I don't think they scouted our best stuff and actually kind of seemed like they found some of our worst in some cases. I'm looking for the combine to really tell us the story. But David, the one that I found interesting was the Indiana pod counts for beans. The largest, they said, since 2002. Soybean pod count estimates 1409.02 versus 13 last year. So David, some interesting numbers coming out of this thing.
Yeah, because the people that were surveying the bean fields here in Indiana noted there's an awful lot of 4-bean pods. And I asked people, are there any 5-bean pods? They didn't answer me. But yes, that is the story on the soybeans, especially when you look at the current yield of 62. You have to imagine that's going to be getting bigger. But look at corn, 187.54. Now, a year ago was 180.89. The USDA in August was 207. So the point I want to stress is there was some corn fields they did find that they wanted to ignore, but they weren't able to because there's some parts of Indiana that don't look as good.
Yeah, John, we look at the USDA numbers and we think those are a little bit low, and then this Pro Farmer Crop Tour comes through and they're even lower than USDA.
I know. I'll give you my opinion that I think to a certain degree this crop tour is a waste of time. I don't think it gives us really accurate enough, meaningful numbers. For one thing, you're doing it a little bit too soon. I know that they realize that they go the same route, and therefore they compare a 3-year average with the USDA 3-year average and adjust their final numbers. But typically, the Pro Farmer Tour is below the final USDA yield about 2/3 of the time with both corn and soybeans. So whatever they come out with, we're looking at big numbers. This tells me this crop could very well get bigger. And if I listen to what David had to say, David, were you trying to tell me that maybe the Indiana yield will possibly exceed 207, the last USDA estimate?
That's what I feel very, very strongly. And one thing that Kieran Braun said on Twitter, because she was part of the crop tour, she said, don't compare the Pro Farmer Crop Tour numbers to the USDA numbers. Compare the numbers from the Pro Farmer Crop Tour from year to year to year. Because if you look at corn in Indiana, a year ago was 180.89. This year, 187.54. So what she's saying is this is a really good crop year this year, but don't compare it to the USDA. It's two different things.
Yeah.
Well, you also said it that the Indiana estimate in the August USDA, which was 62 bushels, pretty much said that you believe that's going to go higher
I do,
than 62.
yes.
Wow.
So when I see 1409 versus the last year 1309 and the 3-year average is 1238, that looks like an awfully good bean crop.
Yeah, awfully good. With all of this abundance, prices are probably destined to go even a little bit lower, and I hate to even say that. But boy, the flash sales were way up, and that's some of the demand that we need more of than anything else at the moment. And flash sales, David, literally littered the market landscape this week with multiple orders on consecutive days.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like China, or unknown, which is typically China, was out buying, but Mexico was buying beans and corn too. And to see this consistency, and then last week's sales at 1.676 and corn 1291, that looks like really solid numbers. And most of these are going on the beans to China, but most of the corn's going to Japan and Korea. And who was big buyer of wheat? Mexico and the Philippines. So we had very strong demand. And hey, one of the reasons is watch the dollar, because it's been failing lately. But as the dollar keeps working lower and lower and lower, that automatically makes the grain cheaper to the foreign buyer because he has to change his currency into the dollar to buy it. So that's good for him.
Yeah, David, I was going to bring that up and ask you why had this sudden surge of interest in new crop corn and beef purchases, and you just nailed that. But you mentioned wheat. Guess what set a new low this past week? Wheat. And the primary reason for that apparently is because of China is in their wheat harvest. They're probably getting close to finishing up their wheat harvest. It looks like they're going to have a record wheat crop. And China, over the last several months, has been a big buyer of wheat in the world markets, but now they're gone since they've got their crop ready to move into their marketing channels. So the lack of China's buying of the wheat has hurt the wheat market, therefore setting a new low this week.
One of the things that is a question for me, and I want you guys to weigh in on this, but Chinese soybean crush is down for the 6th week in a row. Feed demand for them is pretty much in the dumper, and it has been for a while. And China's soybean meal stocks, according to StoneX, are at historical levels. You know, we've been talking for weeks as well about the huge stockpiles of beans at the Chinese ports. Aside from the fact that the dollar is low and so prices are low, so it is a good time to buy. But I mean, there's almost more reasons for China not to buy at the moment.
Yeah, they don't need it.
Yeah.
You know, because of the depressed economy in China, which we keep hearing about that, but I keep getting more numbers all the time about how bad it is. Their hog numbers are way down. That's a sharp reduction in need for feed demand. So therefore, here you go. They got plenty of meal, record stocks of soybean meal, so they don't need to buy soybeans to produce any more meal. It all comes back to China.
And David, one of the other things to just kind of throw into the mix here is that China has been buying a lot of corn, but not from us. They've been buying it from Ukraine, the dominant supplier of corn to China right now.
Yeah, in fact, Ukraine's best customer is China. And, you know, we keep feeling like China's a capitalist country, and they're not. They're a communist country. Okay, the people might be capitalist-minded, but the government's communist, and they like to store grain. Remember, they had 5 years of grain a couple of years ago. They were trying to sell it off, even though it was in storage, and it was a mess. Yeah. But that's the Chinese communist government idea, is to stockpile grain, especially when the prices have come down. So that's what's driving the Chinese demand for soybeans right now. It's not for the capitalist demand of the country. It's for the government demand to put it into storage.
Well, and cheap prices, too. John, you and I took a deep dive, no pun intended, to this whole issue of the Mississippi River here over the last 3 years. You know, remember you and I talking about that, about, you know, it was gotten so low that they were finding old shipwrecks that they never knew existed before. Yeah. Well, that river is down again, and that combined with this Canadian rail strike nonsense that lasted for about 17 hours, all of a sudden, the supply chain issue came back into focus again this past week.
Oh, yes, here we go again. The 3 past years, we've had serious problems with low water on the Mississippi River, and it's happening again. The water level has gotten very low. So what's happening is that reduces the amount of freight. For example, barges can only be 70% full, so therefore you've lost 30% of your freight market. Therefore, the cost of freight goes up. When that's the case, it just costs more to transport it from the interior, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, Iowa, et cetera, down the rivers. And that causes the basis at the Gulf to get stronger, and that backs up into the interior river points, the elevators along those river points. Their basis gets cheaper. So therefore, if the interior basis gets cheaper, things get ugly, spreads widen out. We saw this happen, serious problem last year. It looks like we're headed there again. And if you check the basis levels, especially along river points, it's getting dirtbag cheap, and we've got a huge crop coming on top of that. So looks like we're going to have a real space crunch this coming fall.
At a time when we really need to be selling stuff, it's the worst time to be selling. David, cattle and hogs both look pretty strong going into the end of this past week. I suspect some of the cattle was maybe, anticipating the cattle on feed report on Friday?
Definitely, yes. And I think that they were quite poised to do that because we've got Labor Day coming up, your last big barbecue weekend of the year, and the demand for beef grew much bigger than expected. And the big surprise is that they put out red meat production is up in July. That's across the board. That's pork and beef both. We did provide a lot more of this meat. Look at August then coming down the road. That should be strong too. And if the cattle on feed report has any strength to it, that certainly would put this to a new high level on the cattle and the hogs potentially. But I tell you, every time they've been trying to approach the highs lately, they've been selling off of that. So it's going to be hard to predict here, especially as we go into the fall. And of course, October is National Pork Month. And the reason that it is, that's when you get the most hogs.
And that's when I stock up on pork ribs. Put that in the freezer. Yep. Boy, I tell you what, loving that stuff. All right, time for the final word. John Cavanaugh, we were just talking about prices, and I understand you've got something about prices?
Well, something that I just happened to run across recently, and that's when the December corn futures contract sets its low during the course of the entire time that it's on the board that's being traded. And it's kind of interesting. If you look at the last 6 months of the year, which would, of course, be July, August, September, October, November, December, 70% of the time, the low is set during that time period. Now, in November and December, 1/3 of the time, that kind of surprised me, but 1/3 of the time, the December contract is, as it gets toward the end of its life, it sets its contract low. Now, what does all this mean? Well, we're almost through August, and I don't think the low that we've seen on December corn futures yet is going to hold. All I can say is statistical analysis strongly suggests that we have not seen the low in corn or soybeans yet.
John, is this a typical year for the corn and soybeans? Because people are acting like this is typical. What makes this year so different from other years?
Oh, this is definitely not typical, Dave. This is definitely an atypical year. For one thing, we have the August USDA report forecast a record yield for both corn and soybeans, both of them, in August, which means that the chances are, big crops get bigger, that those yields are going to grow even more. And why has it been kind of an atypical year? Because we've had some of the best growing weather we've had in many, many years.
Yeah.
And for example, Hurricane Beryl comes through the Midwest and dumps rain all over the Midwest just as we hit pollination period. Folks, that has never happened before in history.
Thanks, guys. Kohli and Cavanaugh made possible each week by support from the Allen County Farm Bureau. And I know your local county farm bureaus are supporting Indiana agriculture every single day. And to keep up with that, Indiana Farm Bureau members can sign up for The Dispatch, the electronic newsletter that is sent out weekly during the legislative session and every other week the rest of the year. Topics covered in recent issues include the Farm Bill, the primaries, and updates from Farm Bureau task forces. To start getting The Dispatch, all you got to do is go online to infb.org. Just another one of the great benefits you get from your membership. Go online to itpaystobeamember.org.
Podcasts by Federated Media.